Good afternoon. I'm Tim Slesinger. I'm the founder and CEO of LendingWell. We're opening up the new asset class of direct lending to the mass retail market. At a time when we're all searching for yield, we're particularly excited about this new asset class because it sits very comfortably between the guarantee of a bank deposit and the potential volatility of other investments. It's very much the case of a sensible amount of risk for a sensible return. LendingWell is providing a simple single point of access for retail investors to take advantage of loan investment products offered by a range of peer-to-peer platforms. Peer-to-peer lending has gained the support of the UK government over the last 5 to 6 years, resulting in them issuing the third grade of ISA, which is the Innovative Finance ISA, which is really exciting for all of us in the industry. But there's currently no conduit or platform that satisfies the very strict criteria that advisors need. So LendingWell is very much setting out to satisfy that need.
We've got a disclaimer here, which you probably can't read, small font, but just saying, there is some investment advice here, but use with appropriate caution. Should I just say a couple of words? Tim, I should say, by way of background, he has successfully set up and sold 2 businesses previously, one in Hong Kong and Russia, so has fantastic credentials as an entrepreneur. Myself, I've been working at Liberum Investment Bank for the last 4 or 5 years. Last 3 years, more or less 100% full time, looking at peer-to-peer lending. I was a banks analyst for 10 years, looking at the likes of HSBC and Standard Chartered. And then after about 10 years of doing that, found out about peer-to-peer and got extremely excited about the opportunity to completely disintermediate the banking industry globally. And it was a bit like a moment of a Damascus moment for St. Paul or whatever. And since then, it's kind of been full steam peer-to-peer. So that's just a little bit in terms of background. And then today we're going to cover the income opportunity. There is a very interesting income opportunity with relatively low risk, as we'll see. There are some key risks that you need to be a bit careful with. And then we just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the infrastructure that makes it really easy and convenient to get into the sector.
So I think for those that don't know, what does a peer-to-peer platform actually do? Well, it finds credit-worthy borrowers. It underwrites them and does the credit referencing, and then it contractually connects with the lenders. So the agreement is between the 2 parties, and then services the loan. And the lender gets the majority of the benefit from those arrangements rather than a bank. So this is very similar, if not exactly the same as what banks do now. The peer-to-peer platforms, through technology, just do it more efficiently. The typical loan sizes are between £5,000 and £50,000, and each lender is generally diversified across many loans. So there's a very, very good diversification. It's a global phenomenon. Last year, it was a little under $200 billion, which was matched through the peer-to-peer platforms globally. China was the largest one with about 160 billion. America, a little under 25 billion. And in the UK, we had 5 to 6 billion. Coming forward to 2016, we expect that to be in excess of 300 billion. So there's been an absolutely great take-up of this globally, and that's mainly through the technology that's been available. The returns net of defaults and fees on an unlevered basis in the UK have been a very consistent 5.4%. So it's a really attractive yield, especially if put into an ISA.
And if I could just add to that, 5-6% may not seem like a huge return, but the loan losses behind that are less than 1.5%. So this is a very high quality return. And when you hear from Abundance Generation after this, they actually in fact have 0 loan losses and a similar kind of return. So this is a very, very high quality, low risk, 5 to 6%, which should make it interesting, given that equities are giving you probably no more than 7 or 8%, and you can have bungee jumps where you go down 20% in some years. So why does peer-to-peer work? What's been the big change recently that has suddenly unlocked this new opportunity? Why didn't we think of this 100 years ago? Well, there are 4 main reasons, and the first one is there's been an explosion in the amount of available credit information on individuals outside banks. If you go back 10, 15 years, the banks had a lock on all the information. For any given individual who wanted to borrow, the bank knew more about his credit profile, his ability to service debt than anyone else, so they were the obvious person to do the lending. Over the last 10 years, the credit information value chain has been completely unbundled. So now you can go to Call Credit, Experian, Equifax, and basically type in somebody's name and ideally their address, and you get a whole ton of information in terms of their background, have they ever missed any payments, how much outstanding debt do they have. And then you can use other software called Yodlee. If the borrower gives you permission, you can drill into their bank account and see all their cash flows in and out of their bank account over the last 90 days. And then you can use that to figure out, do they have the ability to service a new piece of debt if they are seeking more debt. Then lastly, there are the companies like Visual DNA, where actually a bit maybe spooky, but the borrower answers 20 questions. If you suddenly got a day off work, what would you do? Would you go for a run? Would you lie in bed? Would you go to the pub? And based on the answers, they can actually figure out your psychometric propensity to repay a loan. That actually is something the banks are not doing. So they're kind of there's a lot of innovation around credit, as you might expect with technology and internet. Second thing is that peer-to-peer platforms, you saw at the beginning what they do. Basically, there are no branches. There aren't armies of compliance officers and regulators and a whole bunch of people they don't know what to do with, but they can't fire because they're on fantastic job security. They have unions. And frankly, just culturally, banks don't like to fire too many people. I mean, they have been steadily laying people off, but ideally they would like to lay off 50% of their workforce, but that would be, there would be riots if they did that. So for a variety of reasons, another point is that banks typically grow by acquisition. So lots of banks are held together with sellotape, where you do 10 M&A acquisitions, you have a whole bunch of technology, and there's only one guy who knows how the 1980s system works. And he basically has it written down on Post-its, like around his computer. And if he left, they would be in trouble. So there's a lot of legacy systems that are making the banks very inefficient. Third one, online, the user experience. So if you go to borrow from a bank, the process is relatively clunky. If you go to a peer-to-peer platform to borrow, very often you can get an answer in 5 minutes. It's this very, very convenient, fast, painless process by comparison. So, and the consequence of that is net promoter scores are positive. So you start to get positive feedback. People start talking about it, and that's very helpful for the sector. And the last point is government is very keen on this. I'm sure most of you remember 2008, and the US and UK economies were going into meltdown because of the financial crisis. The banks had got themselves into all kinds of trouble, and basically the governments had to bail out the banks. They had no choice, because if they didn't, the economy was going to go to zero. And governments don't like to be ransomed like that. So what they would like to do is take away these single points of failure in the economy, which are banks, and thereby reduce systemic risk. So if you have peer-to-peer, it's a bit like the internet. It's very hard to destroy the internet. There's no single place in the world you can blow up and the internet would stop working, because it's diversified, distributed system. Peer-to-peer is the same. So for a variety of reasons, the government's very keen. The other thing to mention is it's a way to get credit to SMEs, small businesses that create jobs. So that's another reason the government really likes peer-to-peer. So these are kind of the 4 main tailwinds, if you like, for the sector. And then here, so do we have sound on that actually? So I just wanted to introduce Giles Andrews, who he's recently got an OBE, Officer of the British Empire from the Queen. He's the CEO, he's the chairman of Zopa.
Zopa was the world's first peer-to-peer lending business when we launched it in 2005. And what we do is we connect capital, and that capital may come from individuals, consumers, so retail capital, or it may even be institutional capital. And we connect that capital with people who want to borrow money. And we do that more efficiently, and we think we do that better than banks do. So the average returns the platform has generated after all losses and after fees are just over 5% over the 11 years we've been in business, 5.1% over 11 years. Now the worst net return, ironically, was right at the beginning. So our net returns in 2006 were only 4.5%, and that was in spite of effectively zero losses, something like 0.1% losses. So that indicates that in the early days we were writing extraordinarily prime loans, so the actual gross coupon on the loans was low. Over time we've been able to increase that slightly while keeping the losses under control. Our worst performance was in the year of 2008, where our loan losses were 3.3%, but the net return to investors was still higher than that 4.5% we made in 2006. So to generate the average of 5.1 over 11 years, our average loan losses have been about 1.4%.
And as a consequence of that high quality in terms of underwriting, there's quite a lot of large institutions have started to pump money through Zopa. So this is looking at some of the data. The top is Zopa. So that if you look at the total bar, that's basically the rate that is being charged to the borrower. The blue is the loan losses. The red are the fees charged by Zopa, and the green is what you get if you invested on the Zopa platform. So from 2005 to 2012, the reason we stopped in 2012 is these are loans that have completely repaid. So the green, you can see you're averaging, 5.9% is the average over that period of time. And you can see, in 2008, equity market was down 30%. Property market was down 20%. Zopa still gave you 6% return. This is rock solid return. You would struggle to create a scenario where Zopa would give you negative returns. This is basically the same calculation, US credit card receivables, the green are your returns. For 20 years, you had positive returns every single year, and the average is 8%. So this chart to me says, this is really interesting. If you could pick one asset class to invest in, personally, I would rather invest in this than any other asset class because of this. And this will stick around for 10 years until the banks figure out what they're doing and figure out a way to either get much more efficient or just shut down.
I think the two risks.
But sorry, just by way of context. So this is the opportunity, but there are risks. So and Giles is going to talk a little bit about the risks around peer-to-peer that you need to get your head around.
I think the two risks that consumers should focus on are the credit risks, i.e. our platforms doing a competent job managing credit risk, and the second thing they should focus on is the operational risk. And within operational risk, I'd include the risk of fraud, I'd include the risk of regulatory, lack of compliance with regulations, all of which could mean redress to borrowers. And the best way to judge a platform's ability to both manage credit and operational risk is to look at its track record. So how long has it been in operation? Has it consistently delivered what it said it would?
Yeah, so that's Giles' take. And so if I kind of summarize kind of what I see as the three key risks, the first one is credit risk. So the platform needs to be able to pick the right borrowers to lend to. Secondly, platform fraud risk. There is a risk that a platform sets itself up, takes your money, and puts some of it in its own back pocket, and then disappears off to Latin America when you figure out actually they've been pulling the wool over your eyes. That to me is actually the biggest risk, and we'll talk a bit about how to mitigate that. And then the third one is cybersecurity risk. So I don't know if you heard about Bitcoin. All of this is online, so you need to have very robust systems to avoid getting hacked, and we'll talk a bit about that as well. So let's talk about credit risk. When it comes to underwriting, I think... Sorry, let's talk about... This is Christian Faye, the CEO of LendingWell, recently got a big investment from Skype's VC, very highly regarded, one of the leading platforms, and he's going to talk about how they...
When it comes to underwriting, I think there's a big misconception with online investment platforms and with peer-to-peer in that, we do things differently. I mean, the reality is we don't. So we do everything that a bank will do when we're underwriting a mortgage. That a bank will do, and that includes the full spectrum of searches that you would expect to be done on a borrower. We have independent valuers go and visit the property. They'll do internal searches, take photographs of the property. That will come back to our team here in the office, and it's not automated, which is another big misconception. We're not creating algorithms that have somehow magically created a better way to underwrite loans. The reality is we use technology to speed up and automate a lot of the work involved with underwriting a mortgage, but at the end of the day, the pack that is put together lands on the desk of an underwriter that is experienced at mortgage underwriting, and they go through the pack and they sort of make a decision. So it's still an experienced human underwriter that makes the decision. Our head of underwriting has been in senior credit roles in mortgages for over 40 years.
So the short answer on credit risk is that effectively the platforms do exactly what the banks have been doing for many decades, and they do it, if anything, better than the banks do. So that's credit risks. Then moving on to the second risk, fraud risk. So there have been some major frauds. I mean, the biggest, highest profile one has been Uzaibo in China earlier this year. Investors in Uzaibo lost $7.6 billion. That's a big chunk of money by anyone's standard. And they're being shut down. And they were literally taking money and putting it in their own pocket. There's a kind of a less severe form of fraud where basically you rob Peter to pay Paul. So Paul wasn't getting a great return on the platform. He came in, a couple of years ago, put his money in there. Returns were disappointing. He's probably getting like 2 or 3%, and they had promised him 10%. So they rob money off Peter, who comes onto the platform more recently, give it to Paul. So Paul's happy, but this is a Ponzi scheme, and after a while it kind of catches up with them. Much smaller, 20, 30 million loss, they're shut down. These are kind of, this is like 50 shades of fraud, if you like, 3 shades of fraud. The third one is information fraud. Lending Club, investors didn't lose any money, they probably lost some sleep. So basically Lending Club changed the dates on some loans they were selling to Jefferies, basically to make them look more like what Jefferies wanted. The board found out, CEO fired, share price went down 50%, since bounced a bit. I think Tim and I have been buying the shares recently, but it seems to be on the mend. But so this is the less serious form of fraud, but the fraud is a big issue, and we'll talk about how to mitigate it. It's been around for a long time. Here's a headline from the 1920s before they had figured out that Ponzi was actually doing a fraud. He refused to reveal how he was making all the money, and then they found out actually he wasn't making the money. This is how to actually deal with fraud. There's kind of 5 pretty comprehensive ways of approaching it. Four, and there's the 5th on the way. Regulators. The industry is regulated in the UK, the US, Australia, New Zealand, and it's starting to be regulated, frankly, all over the world. Main access to clear information, segregation of client money. The second one, this is probably the most powerful way to avoid fraud. So there's large institutions with full-time, highly intelligent, highly trained professional money managers scrutinizing the platform. So they'll literally download the entire loan book, they'll interview everybody, they'll check the background of everyone, and they really watch the platforms like a hawk. They're probably the best way, a little bit like equity research analysts and hedge funds, keep track of equities. So there's several large funds, managing, collectively, $5-10 billion plus of capital looking at these platforms, and they really keep the platforms honest with respect to fraud. And before they come in, they hire guys like Strategic Investment Group, Altus, Baker Tilly, to really do a very deep dive in terms of forensic analysis and deep background checks. So collectively, I think they are a very powerful force to avoid fraud. And then, of course, you've got the likes of PwC and BDO, but of course, we know Arthur Andersen didn't manage to spot the fraud at Enron, so I wouldn't rely too much on these guys, actually. And then lastly, Lloyd's of London, we believe, will start to come in and offer fraud indemnity insurance paid by the platforms that will pay out completely if there is fraud. So those are kind of the more obvious ways to avoid fraud. There is a more powerful way, which is an independent data repository. And I'll just run some audio from a guy in the US that's really leading the charge on that solution.
The marketplace lending industry and the investors in particular are currently very focused on ensuring that the individual loans that they're investing in or providing credit towards are actually what as they're represented by the platforms. So the focus of Global Debt Registry is providing loan level asset certainty, independently validating on behalf of the investment community that all of the information in support of the loan is accurate, is correct. So we validate the individual borrower, confirming that it's a real person and that they're not deceased and that they've got the correct social security number, etc. We validate the credit representation to ensure that the credit information has not been overstated or any errors. Verify that the loan has been dispersed, has actually been funded to that particular borrower, and verify that all of the documentation in support of that loan is in place so that the investor has an enforceable asset with all of the data lined up appropriately.
So that's the approach to deal with fraud. Then if we move on to cybersecurity, that's the other key risk. And essentially, so we know about the Bitcoin hacks and so on. It is a key risk. The main solutions are to hire ethical hackers to try and break the system continuously. encrypt all of the storage, and use firewalls and so on. And with this, and there are some very credible, very capable firms that specialize in this that we are working with, like for example, StealthCare. So there is an obvious way to deal with cybersecurity risk. So we've kind of dealt with these. Credit risk, basically we're doing the same thing that the banks do. Fraud risk, we've got professional money managers, scrutinizing the platforms very closely. And indeed, LendingWell, as we'll talk a bit more about shortly, is also doing very extensive due diligence on platforms. And then cybersecurity, we have the systems in place to deal with that. So once you've dealt with those three risks, in my view, that unlocks the 5 to 7% unlevered return. And it's effectively de-risked and much less risky than equities.
The UK government.
Sorry. So in terms of the attitude of the UK government,
the UK government's been very supportive of peer-to-peer for a number of years. So they've made a number of concessions on our behalf after some pretty extensive lobbying. So the first thing they did was listen to our call for regulation. Somewhat ironically, the leaders in the industry formed a trade association which lobbied the government to become regulated, and that lobbying was successful. And that then served as a gateway to be given various other concessions. So we were lobbying for the inclusion in a tax-efficient savings wrapper called an ISA, and that was then permitted about a year and a half ago.
So now, we've kind of looked at the risks and the opportunities. So how best to invest in peer-to-peer loans? So there are a couple of different ways. You can go direct to the platforms. So in theory, you can go directly to Zopa, Funding Circle, Rate Setter, Abundance Generation, and put money in. Very time-consuming. It means that you have to personally research all of them, do your own due diligence. I don't know how much time you have, but to do that properly, you need to spend several weeks actually to really do it properly. So very time-consuming, but in theory, you can do it yourself. And the second way is to invest in some of the listed investment trusts. There are 3 or 4 that are out there. Liberum, where I've been working, has done 3 of them, and they are a way to get into the space. However, they do charge relatively high fees, much higher fees than LendingWell, we're going to talk about shortly, and also the liquidity is not fantastic. The third way is to go into a GPLP fund, but typically if you want to go in there, you need to be putting a relatively decent amount in. You probably need to be putting in maybe 1 to 5 to 10 million pounds to really get the attention of these guys, and relatively high fees. So the fourth solution, I think, is the one that in this audience should be massively more attractive than the others. It's a P2P aggregator solution. Think Hargreaves Lansdowne or Rightmove Zoopla for peer-to-peer, single point of access to get into the space. There are a few people doing this globally, NSR Invest in the US, and there are a couple of others in the UK. But LendingWell, I think, is the by far the leader in the space. We've been working on this more or less full-time for the last 18 months. So with that, I'll kind of turn it over to Tim, and maybe he can talk us through what LendingWell is and does.
So LendingWell very much is not a fund. We are plumbing, where we connect the partner platforms with the lenders directly. The partner platforms have gone through a lot of due diligence on our side. We have a very strict eligibility criteria, and we only put the platforms that we think are appropriate for retail investment. There's no pooling of cash. Again, the contracts are directly, so the benefits go directly to those lenders. And I think very importantly, the client money is segregated in a custodian account and is held very much on a trust, in a trust environment. Cormac was talking about a lot of the security measures that have taken place. We have a very robust ecosystem that is with ratings, education research, independent data, due diligence, cybersecurity, and all of those things that we pull together to make sure that the investors are not exposed to undue risk.
Yeah. So if I kind of take it from here, the other key attraction of LendingWell is that it's very, very low cost. So we expect when we get to scale, we'll be able to bring it down to 50 basis points per annum, start off at 85 basis points. If you compare the investment trusts I was just talking about, they're typically charging you 2 to 3.5%, so much more expensive. And obviously, you start off with a return, and then those fees come off, and then you get what's left. So to keep that down, for 1 year maybe doesn't sound like much, but if someone's charging you 3% for 10 years, that's 30% less money in your pocket after 10 years. So I think keeping those fees down is really, really important. And LendingWell, because of the way it's set up, it's extremely efficient. So we think and it's very robust. So you're getting a very high quality, safe solution at a low fee. So to some extent, it's a bit like a Vanguard tracker product, which is going to beat actively managed, the average actively managed fund manager, every day of the week. The other point to make is that there's an extremely strong management team here. I talked a bit about Tim's business. He set up businesses and sold them both in Hong Kong and Russia. I don't know about you, but anyone who kind of makes a lot of money in Russia and comes back with all their fingers and toes deserves some respect. And then Paul Bradshaw is also extremely impressive, chairman of the advisory board. He's chairman of Scandia Life. I don't know if you've heard of it. He's currently chairman of Sanlam. He's an executive chairman of Sanlam, executive chairman of Nucleus. He was there very early in St. James's Place. Extremely experienced, highly respected individual in the investment community. And so a very strong team. Altogether, there's 150 years of collective experience there. And I've looked at a lot of business plans. I haven't seen 150 years of collective investment experience on a team. So a very strong team, I would say. Sorry, with that, then we'll show you what the front end looks like. This is basically ready to accept capital. We're keen to kind of show it to you. And sorry, before I show you this video, the voiceover here is from Nick O'Donoghue, who was the former global head of research, all asset classes, institutional and wealth at JP Morgan, and currently works for Bill Gates. He's a senior advisor to Bill Gates.
LendingWell is designed to give you the best overview of existing peer-to-peer platforms in a user-friendly way. It gives you a detailed breakdown of the whole market, and you're one click away from historical net investor returns over time and the due diligence results that you need to make informed investment decisions. Once you've added platform investments to your basket, the portfolio is back-tested on a pro forma basis over the preceding 12-month period. The system will show you the product breakdown, the platforms you've chosen, and the allocated percentages, and it will indicate the diversification by sector and also any tax wrappers. With the pre-selected investment portfolios, namely LendingWell Access, LendingWell Diversified, and LendingWell Asset Backed, each has a downloadable fact sheet, which provides all the key information, including allocation and strategy. These are simple and convenient to add to your investment basket, having decided on your risk, return, and liquidity preferences. The LendingWell dashboard shows all of your loan investment holdings in a very simple format: cash positions, loan book mix, tax wrapper breakdown, and any pending orders. And it also gives you the historical returns graph for the trailing 12-month period.
So that's an overview of the front end, which you would be very happy to talk through with any of you interested. And then here's just a kind of an elevator pitch, kind of summary of LendingWell from Tim, actually.
What we're providing is a simple single point of access for wealth managers to take advantage of all of the investment opportunities made available by direct lending platforms. We enable wealth managers to view the sector on a whole market basis and to access research on a like-for-like basis on every product, and then to monitor their investments on an ongoing basis in a very data-rich manner. So of course investors can go directly to platforms themselves, but opening and managing multiple peer-to-peer accounts is very time-consuming and often very confusing. And just choosing one is very risky. There are also investment trusts available, but with these there's very little liquidity.
And then here's Nick briefly on the value proposition as he sees it, former global head of research, JP Morgan.
I think LendingWell is a good idea because in what is currently a very fragmented market, it takes a look at all the individual platforms. It provides its clients with qualitative and quantitative assessments of the strength of those platforms. It provides real analytical data, looking at previous track records, looking at the risks, the write-offs that these platforms have experienced, and really allows investors to make informed decisions as to how they invest in peer-to-peer lending.
So that's LendingWell in a nutshell. Here's a kind of exercise that we've done to kind of in a quantitative basis, look at the different ways that you can invest in peer-to-peer. The investment trust, doing it yourself, managed accounts and the Peertopeer aggregator LendingWell. We kind of scored them on due diligence. Are you getting the whole market? Are you diversified? Are you making informed decisions? Are there any conflicts of interest which are kind of going to distort your returns? Are the fees okay? Is it convenient? Is it liquid? When you score those 1 to 4, 4 being good, you find that the aggregators kind of do best actually. So, you know, if you do a kind of quantitative factor analysis, you come to the same conclusion that we're kind of getting intuitively.
I think
So, and then here's just Christian talking about how the platforms see LendingWell.
Sorry to interrupt. We might have to leave it there, gentlemen. Thanks very much. Just because the next presenter needs to start.
Really? Okay, fine. Do you mind if we just go to the contact details at the end?
Yeah, absolutely. Do that.
I think.
Okay. Do you want to just?
There we are. If anyone would like to have any information, please come and find us later, or if you'd like to contact us directly.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
That was great.
Thank
Thank
you
you very much. And sorry to cut you off early.
That's all right.